So in the reading corner today, I'm really pleased to be welcoming Ben Mantle. Well, Ben studied animation at Surrey Institute of Art and Design, and after graduating, he had experience of working on Tim Burton's Corpse Bride, one of my favourite films, before moving to Brighton to work as head of animation in a media company, focusing on character and background. These design elements are particularly strong in Ben's children's books, and I'm sure we're going to be discussing that today. Ben has been working as a children's book illustrator since 2008 and has gone on to write his own stories. We're going to be talking about his latest offering, Frog versus Toad, though no doubt we will touch on other stories too, including a particular favourite of mine, Bunnies on the Bus. So welcome into the reading corner, Ben.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you.
We are going to talk about Frog versus Toad. So I thought I'd just explain for listeners a little bit about it, and then perhaps you could read some as a way in to our discussion. So it's a verbal battle, this story, basically, between a frog and a toad, and it kicks off when they both catch the same fly for dinner. And the fly says, "What a terrible day to be eaten by two frogs." Well, they're both insulted by that. The fly can't tell the difference between them, and they start hurling insults at each other. I have to say, it reminded me a bit of a rap battle that was going on between them. Things get out of hand, and the metaphoric mudslinging turns into a literal mud-slinging match, but more about that later. First of all, Ben, I wonder if you would give us a flavour of the story and read some of it to us.
Absolutely. So, Frog versus Toad. Frog was hiding in the leaves. His stomach was rumbling. The juicy fly was almost close enough to taste. Snap. Dinner was served. Snap. Suddenly, another tongue flew out of nowhere. "Hey, let go! I saw the fly first," mumbled Frog. "No, let go," came the reply. "Oh, this is the worst day ever," squealed the fly. "I'm being eaten by two frogs." "Two frogs? How rude." "That one is a toad," gasped Frog. "Frogs are nothing like toads." "Yeah, I'm not a slimy frog," bellowed Toad. The fly saw its chance and buzzed off. "Wait, did you just call me slimy?" croaked Frog. "Well, you're dry and lumpy." Toad was cross. "Oh, why don't you hop it, Longlegs?" And there we go. We've got a little introduction to Frog versus Toad. Can I say how glad that you introduced it with the metaphorical and literal mudslinging?
Oh, good.
Because that was actually not originally in the book at the start. That actually was a sort of a publisher idea. And then as it sort of got introduced, I was like, oh, that's brilliant. It's sort of such a good metaphor for the insult throwing and then the literal mud throwing.
Mm. And, you know, that's how ideas often come together, isn't it? They're not all there at the outset. Very often one thing leads into another.
Definitely. And as all of my book ideas sort of it started with a really sort of ridiculous conversation with my girlfriend, Alice McKinley, who's also a children's book illustrator and author. And we were just talking about sort of what would be a really silly sort of verses kind of book in the way that you have them, I guess, with sort of really cheesy sort of films of sort of sharks versus aliens or something ridiculous. And we were sort of just riffing on that idea of what would be a really silly kids book and what would be sort of fun to see almost sort of going head to head sort of against each other when Frog versus Toad popped into my head. And so that's sort of, it really did start from sort of a really silly, sort of pithy idea and then grow into something sort of quite different.
I mentioned in the beginning about your animation background. And in a way, this is a real class in character development because you've got these two amphibians, one frog, one toad, and you've got to make these characters very distinct and get the frogginess of a frog and the toadiness of a toad. Tell me a little bit about the process that you went through to develop these two.
Well, a bit of research, and then it's pretty much just onto the sketchbook, just drawing a lot of different frogs and a lot of different toads, and then sort of boiling down their essence, I guess. With the frog, he's going to have to be sort of physically different, because that's what this book is sort of really is about, is the physical differences. So you've got sort of skinny, long-legged, sort of shiny, big bulging-eyed frog versus sort of the sort of squat, wider toad with his small eyes, and that sort of allows, with a little bit of exaggeration, to sort of help the sort of insults, I guess, as well.
One of the great things is that we're introduced to Frog before the story proper starts, and he's just two big eyes looking over the log, and that's a point in case about the kind of exaggeration of his characteristics.
The book is a tricky one in that respect, and I think that was the battle with Frog and Toad, is because they have to look close enough to be related, as you find out in the book they are, but that there's enough difference between them to sort of for them to believe they're different, and for the readers to sort of start off thinking that as well, I guess, and to see, just to sort of be aware that Fly has got this wrong.
Now, this may or may not have been in your head at the time of creating the book, but as a reader and somebody that obviously spends a lot of time analysing books, you suddenly become aware of a theme that's going on there, that is, they're more alike than they are different. And of course, you can apply that to people as well.
Yes.
And then we've got the twist in the tale, which kind of reinforces that too.
Yeah, definitely.
Was that part of your thinking?
Well, I'd drawn these two characters, this sort of little sketch of Frog and Toad looking at each other, and I was sort of starting to figure out the sort of bare bones of the story. And I was actually influenced by, I guess, the times. You couldn't avoid that we had the lovely President Trump talking about building a wall to separate himself from Mexico, and that idea, and like Brexit and all that kind of idea. It seemed like there was a narrative at the time of looking at differences rather than similarities, and that definitely fed into the idea of the book. And that's what I liked about it, was that hopefully it's not too sort of didactic with its sort of message, because I did want it to also just be a really silly, entertaining book first.
You have a background in character and kind of background setting design. And so I looked at your books, with that kind of view in mind. And we're going to talk a little bit about another book, Bunnies on the Bus, in a moment, which is quite different. But this one, it seemed to me that you were almost setting up a stage or a wrestling ring for these characters to perform in. I wonder what it was like for you and how you decided to create the world for these characters.
Yeah, well, actually, when I was writing this, I really had the idea in my mind that it would be two main characters and quite a simple setting. And I've always sort of thought that a book is sort of like a mini theatre in itself, and like each page turn is just a sort of a set change or a new act almost. So that very much was an influence for this book, definitely. So I knew I wanted the world to be really contained and feel like a set, and it was really just about the characters being sort of forefront. I mean, there's a few little sort of background characters in there as well, which I can't not put into books, it seems.
No, they're just gorgeous. And what I do think about your books that works so well is that they have so much child appeal. I know from watching children read that they love to spot those little things in pictures. Yes. And, an adult and child are going to be going back to this book time and time again, night after night.
Yeah, definitely. The sort of always have that in the back of my head, that idea of repeat readings. And I really like throwing in those little hidden things and the little visual things that can either be skipped if you don't want to read them that night, or if you want to sort of indulge in the book, you can delve in a little bit deeper.
They love insects, ladybirds, which you've got in there. You've got your ants and your spiders. So they'll be really happy.
Well, I think as well for the child, it's almost like a little secret that they're sort of let in on, because they're not necessarily in control of the words, but they're in control of roaming around the pictures and delving in and seeing what they can find.
Yeah. Now, I absolutely love the humour in your visual storytelling. And we're going to talk about that with Bunnies in the Bus, because it's superb. But it did seem to me that both writing and illustrating this book, Frog versus Toad, gave you more scope to closely juxtapose text and illustration to humorous effect. So, for instance, there's a part where Toad mentions Frog's swivelly eyes, and the frog says he hasn't noticed, but of course the illustration exaggerates the swiveliness of their eyes, that kind of ironic moment, which you could only really be in control of if you have both the text and the image to work with. So did you find that, or do you find that writing and illustrating afford you a different kind of creative freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a natural writer, I wouldn't say, certainly coming from the illustration side first, but it's really lovely actually to sort of start with that text and then to start drawing, and then the two influence each other. And that's really lovely. And you can do some really nice bits of sort of self-editing because you know exactly what the image is at quite an early stage, or you know roughly what the image is going to look like. So actually you can remove text that is unnecessary, or you can really play around with it as you're sort of mapping out that story. So definitely it absolutely does allow you to sort of play with them a little bit more, rather than as opposed to sort of receiving a text, which, might have a few changes once you've illustrated, but generally it's pretty locked in by that point.
Interesting. One of the things that I try to do with both adults, because I work a lot with teachers and children, is to look closely at pictures in picture books to see if they can see how the pictures have been made, whether they can discern things about the material or the textures. Of course, it's actually quite difficult to be 100% sure in a world that is so digital, where you can create so many effects digitally. And I sort of appreciate that. When I looked at your illustrations, it looks to me as though you use a range of materials, including digital processes. I could be wrong, but they look to be marks like crayon or pastel and watercolour. And I'd be interested to know more about what you do use and the expressiveness of different types of materials.
Well, firstly, you've done well. That's good guesswork, because Frog versus Toad is sort of pastel charcoal sort of shape drawing, and then that's scanned in and then coloured digitally, so I can then sort of overlay it and change the colours as I go. And then with a bit of sort of pencil texture thrown in, or sort of even sometimes a bit of paint for the mud. There was a bit of sort of paint splattering going in there as well. And the same with Bunnies on the Bus is pencil drawings, or pencil. It's almost like sort of scribbling the shapes, and then they get overlaid onto digital to sort of do the colour. I love the effects of traditional sort of mediums, the sort of the happy mistakes that you get with them, and then obviously the total benefit of doing it digitally and being able to change a colour in a few seconds. And it's funny actually, because from an animation world, I started very digitally. Everything I did was pretty digital, because that's sort of how we made stuff and how we animated stuff, and everything looked digital. And then when I entered the publishing world, there was definitely a sort of an aversion to digital artwork at that point. And children's books was a much more traditional watercolor, sort of pastel, sort of kind of medium. But it meant that sort of as I started, I was hiding the digital bit of my work. And then actually it's actually just what I do now, and I really enjoy that process, even though it is quite like it can be really labored, like drawing out every leaf separately. And so I'll usually pastel them in grey scales, like sort of, like have a medium grey, a light grey and a dark grey, and I'll work between those colours to get my sort of tone and variation and texture. And then they're scanned in and coloured. So it is laborious actually sometimes, but now it's definitely something that I think ties my work together, is that use of the two. It's funny where it sort of started from was like a sort of a feeling like I had to do that, and now the sort of publishing world is a different, I think, a different landscape to certainly when I started.
Always interested when people choose to do the laborious stuff because there's something about the process of doing it for yourself, not just the book at the end, I think, for some people anyway.
Yes, definitely. There's you really miss it if you don't do it for a while. Like just the freedom of some of my newer stuff that I'm doing at the moment, it's actually quite a bit looser because I'm sort of playing with the charcoal a little bit more and letting it do its own natural thing, because my battle is definitely fighting the refining bit too much. Like digital is such a powerful tool that it's almost, you can zoom in to see something that would be, sort of like a hand width, but you can have it, to sort of at such a microscopic scale that you can keep on refining and refining and refining. And that's the beauty of traditional work, is those mistakes and the fact that you actually have less control.
I'd like to bring in Bunnies on the Bus. So again, just to introduce this story, it's about a brood of bunnies, text by Philip Arder. They board a bus and create havoc. It's a situation that anyone will recognise if they boarded a bus at the end of a school day. There's a lot going on in the pictures, however, that are not in the text. And so it seems to me this is a very different book to Frog versus Toad. Again, it's got really strong child appeal. And I'd just like to start with the beginning of that book. This townscape, it kind of leads you to think about the whole world. And there are lots of windows, and everything that's happening in those windows is potentially another story, some of which will come together in the main story and some of which won't. So faced with this text, you've turned it into something completely different. So how did that happen?
The beauty of Philip's text is, and having written books myself, it's really hard to sort of cut down your words. And that's something that Philip does so well, that the text actually just allows me the room to almost do like whatever I want. And I think when I first read it, you just get a sort of a Word document through, and it had such a lovely rhythm to it. And so you want to read it fast. And so there's a bit of me that was like, okay, you're going to, you could potentially get through this book quite quickly. So I was like, okay, if this, again, is going to have some repeat, readability, it's great if you can go back and you can then spot bits.
It's more than detail, though. You've actually put in a whole new narrative. They're lemurs, are they?
Yes, they are lemurs on the first page with the map who are distracting the elephant driver.
But yes. Then there's the raccoons that are wanted, aren't they?
Oh, yes, the squirrels who are... yes, it's the bandana. Yeah, I think I knew pretty early on with Bunnies that I was going to try and add some sort of other narratives running through. And that was tricky. I mean, we're actually working on a second at the moment, and it's tough because you're trying to make sure that the text narrative gets its own time to shine, because it's, that's important, and then throw in all these little interweaving stories. And you've only got, the sort of 12, 14 pages to sort of get those narratives in as well. So it was a lot of planning on who was appearing on what page. And like you say, actually, it's funny you sort of noted the windows on the first page, because they're again going back to that kind of idea of books being theatre. It's like shining a spotlight on your story. So each window is the starting sort of act for each story. But yeah, that was tricky, to say the least. A lot of going back and forth, and then sometimes knowing where that character's going to end up and then working it backwards. It's a really tricky bit. But definitely that's a bit of my animation influences, I guess, coming in as well, because I think animation does that really well.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask is, where you have got so much going on, how do you draw attention to the key part of the narrative?
Composition, I guess, is the first thing. And I think that's actually more how I draw. I see things almost as the page is a camera, or a sort of a stage. And so you place your main characters either in the foreground, in the lightest part, your sort of composition either leads you round, in Bunnies, you've got the road to fit in. So you have this natural path running through a page that's actually great at almost leading you through a story. You start left and travel right, which is how you read a book, and also, the direction the bus is traveling in. So composition was a big thing. And then lighting, you can use that to your effect as well, because, sort of you can play with the contrast of dark and lights, and, putting that contrasting figure in makes you, draws your eye to them. So there's definitely a bit of that play as well.
Yeah, and on that first page, you talk about the road being a sort of movement or pathway. But there's actually quite a lot of movement in that first image. There are letters floating in a particular direction, and the wind and everything is kind of pushing you towards the bus. Even though it's very busy, you're constantly being pushed towards the bus.
Yeah, and that was definitely intentional. You use all those tricks, right? Sort of, it's funny, actually, I was listening to another podcast you did with Dapo, who was talking about illustration as magic. And I thought that was actually quite a nice metaphor for it, because, magic is sort of about hiding your tricks, right? And I think that's the same with creativity and, art and publishing and, sort of picture books, is you're hiding those tricks. You don't want them to be too obvious, but they're there, and you're using those tricks to sort of help guide the viewer through the book.
Definitely. Reminded me a little bit, I don't know if Richard Scarry was ever part of your reading repertoire as a child, but the characters reminded me very much of something like Busy Town, and of course it's called Sunny Town, isn't it, on the bus?
A few people have said that to me, actually. And I guess he has that idea of quite simple text and then the sort of visual storytelling bit as well.
I also thought I detected you enjoying the process for its own sake. I mean, did I detect 4 beetles crossing a zebra crossing like Abbey Road?
Did. I like to throw in the odd thing, because I think of the adults reading the book at the time, and it's really funny just to throw something like that in. And I love it when that gets picked up, because, a whole load of people will read it and not see it. And that's why it's in there, is it's sort of there to reward the people who are paying attention to the sort of the details. Bunnies especially was great for just throwing a whole load of silly stories in the background and then seeing who spots them.
Yeah, good fun, really good fun. I wanted to ask a little bit about the traditional qualities in your artwork. It has, in spite of what we've been saying about, animation and digital work, the actual stories themselves feel quite traditional, as though they belong to that classic tradition of storytelling. I wondered who your main influences are.
Yeah, I would say I loved the scary children's books. So there was I'm Coming to Get You. I don't know if you remember that book, which I loved. Yes, the Tony Ross one, which I loved because there was something really creepy about it as a child.
Until you get to the end.
Well, yeah. Which also I love, because it's that classic thing of pulling the rug from under your feet. It's sort of, you think you know what it is, and then at the last moment changes your perception, which I love about it. And even though as a kid I knew that was the ending, it still went back to being scary. And then obviously you've got some of the classics, Where the Wild Things Are, and those sort of things. But actually I guess my inspirations really would be more animation based, I would say. I mean, classic Disney ones, Pinocchio, although I watched Pinocchio recently, and boy, that film is creepy. But the art style of it, definitely.
Just thinking about the animator who did that, I think he was the animator for Snow White as well.
Yes,
which I just adore. I can't believe how old it is.
Yeah, and still feels. Well, that's the beauty of those writers. They don't grow old. They're so timeless that and it's weird. I mean, like you could say the politics of things have changed a little bit, but you can still watch them and appreciate the craftsmanship of them for sure.
So we've got a new book. Is it with a Philippada text?
Yes.
In process now?
It is. Yeah, more bunnies. It's called Bunnies on the Boat. So even though they, at the end of Bunnies on the Bus, get on a train, Philip has decided to put them on a boat this time.
Okay.
Just to really mess with everybody.
Well, I suspect aeroplanes will come in somewhere along the line. If not in the next book, maybe the one after that.
You wouldn't be wrong.
And what about your own writing projects? What's next there?
Honestly, I don't know. Hopefully with Walker again. And I do have an idea that's sort of at really early stages, which will actually probably be quite different to Frog versus Toad in tone, maybe. And I think that probably sums me up, which is I tend to jump around a little bit from serious to silly to sort of digital to traditional, a bit of a sort of a magpie short. Yes, exactly.
From lily pad to lily pad. Do you know, it's been so delightful talking to you today. I've really enjoyed it, and you've given me so much insight into your books. It's brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben.
Oh, thank you, Nikki. It was lovely to chat to you too.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a review for us. To find out about other projects, including an audience with events and the Exploring Children's Literature Summer School, visit www.exploringchildrensliterature.uk. Join us again soon in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.